All right, welcome to Open Democracy's webinar, how journalists and the media should cover the Christian right. My name is Teddy Wilson. I am Open Democracy's US investigations editor. I'm based here in Texas. Open Democracy is a global nonprofit news site. We cover a range of issues around the world. We have journalists and editors stationed in several continents. And I'm part of Open Democracy's 50-50 team, which covers tracks the backlash to reproductive rights, sexual health and rights, and LGBTQ rights. But today's topic, we're going to talk a little bit about how the media and journalists should cover the Christian right. And I have a great panel of journalists and experts on religion and the Christian right that I'm joined with today. And I'm going to introduce each of them to you right now, starting with Katherine Stewart.
Hi, I'm Katherine Stewart. I'm an independent journalist. My latest book, which came out earlier this year, is The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. My previous book, The Good News Club, focused on the religious right and public education. And my work has appeared in the New Republic, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New York Review of Books, among others. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And now our second panelist is Adelle Banks.
Hi, I'm Adelle Banks of Religion News Service. I'm a longtime reporter on the topic of religion, and Religion News Service is a nonprofit that covers religion, spirituality, and ethics, and is relied on by secular and faith-based organizations, some of whom we publish our stories. I cover a variety of topics, including Christians and Christianity, religion and race, and lots of other things, from music to interfaith relations to congregational issues.
And finally, our third panelist is Heidi Schlumpf.
Pronunciation there, Teddy. Heidi Schlumpf. I'm the executive editor of the National Catholic Reporter, so you can find us at ncronline.org. I previously served as the national correspondent for the newspaper, which has been around for 56 years and covering the intersection of Catholicism, culture, politics. I've been a journalist for 30 years, and most of that time have specialized in covering religion, especially the Catholic Church. So I'm really grateful to be here.
All right, well, thank you all for joining us. I'm really pleased by our panelists today. I think we're gonna have a really great discussion. To give our audience a little preview of what we're gonna be discussing, we're gonna be discussing 3 specific topics, and then at the end, we'll have more of an open forum to give folks a chance to maybe reply to some of the questions that you have left in the chat, or to cover some topics maybe we didn't address. But first, we're going to talk about white evangelical Christians. Then we're going to talk about race and gender in the Christian right. And then we'll talk about where is the real center of political gravity within the Christian right. But to talk first about white evangelical Christians, the main question to frame this is, are journalists asking the right questions? So it seems oftentimes, especially within the past year and during the presidential campaign, one of the questions that journalists tend to use to frame their reporting is why do white evangelical Christians support Donald Trump so much? But I want to know if there's other questions that journalists should be asking. So I think we'll start first with Heidi. What do you think the questions that journalists should be asking about white evangelical Christians?
Well, the reporters that I read are asking really good questions, and we certainly can't argue that white evangelical Christians haven't been covered enough in both secular and religious media. I think I would make another critique, which is that sometimes Catholics are left out, white Catholics and especially conservative Catholics are left out of those stories. So sometimes, obviously, we've been covering them in the Catholic media, but when I read secular coverage, I often see this heavier emphasis on evangelical Christians who are Protestant. So I think that the term evangelical Catholic is not one that we use. I know Mike Pence once described himself that way, but there is a lot of synergy between evangelical Protestant Christians in the United States and evangelical Catholics. In fact, a number of the leaders in the more conservative Catholic movement are former evangelicals, or vice versa. We have evangelical leaders who are former Catholics, or some of them go back and forth. And today's conservative Catholics share a lot in common with other conservative Christians. In fact, they might share more in common with them ideologically and politically sometimes than they do with their fellow progressive Catholics, of whom I count myself. So sometimes they're called different things. We use the term conservative. They often refer to themselves as traditionalists. The phrase rad trad is something you'll hear in Catholicism, which refers to radical traditionalists, sometimes younger ones. So I guess that's the question that I would ask reporters to think about is, are you including other voices beyond the evangelical Protestants?
Adele, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you for asking. I think that white evangelical Christians has sort of become this shorthand for an extraordinarily complex group of people. And it can mean everyone from Franklin Graham, who is more conservative than his evangelist father, Billy Graham, to Russell Moore, who's a Southern Baptist ethicist who at one point spoke out against Donald Trump before he became president. And that was to the chagrin of some members of his own denomination and the appreciation of others. And then there's Joel Hunter, who is a former Orlando pastor who recently helped launch Evangelicals for Biden and was a faith advisor to former President Barack Obama. So there's such a wide range that I think sometimes people have a picture of maybe one of those people I just mentioned in their minds when they hear white evangelical Christians, and there needs to be more questions to sort of understand a little bit more about who the people are. I would suggest that journalists get to basic and not so basic details like the name of the church the person is attending, the denominational affiliation, especially if there's not a denominational affiliation in the name of their church, which happens a lot. And if they're Baptist, what kind of Baptist? Because there is a wide range of Baptists, some of whom would not call themselves evangelical, even though there's the lowercase e evangelical idea behind most Baptists. But what do you believe? What does your faith make you most passionate about? How do your theological beliefs relate to your political beliefs? I think people kind of have to dig in a little more. And also, what does your church look like on Sunday morning? Is it predominantly white? And if they say it's multicultural or diverse, ask them what that means, because experts say that multiracial congregations have only no single racial or ethnic group that's more than 80% of the people in the pews. And some people who say they belong to a diverse evangelical church may have a different definition than those sociologists did. Also, one more is if there's meeting in person right now, that might just give you a sense of whether they think their congregation is quote unquote essential, which has been a big argument amongst some churches right now as to whether they need to meet in person or whether they can stream their services.
Right, thank you, Adele. I mean, you bring up a great point. I think as someone that grew up in Texas, in a pretty conservative part of Texas, kind of one of the points of conversation you usually have with people when you first meet is, where do you go to church? And I've heard very few people say that they go to an evangelical church, right? Most, I think, white evangelical Christians tend to identify themselves as going to either a Baptist church or maybe a non-denominational Bible church or something like that. So I think that's a really great point you bring up about looking at kind of what they believe and what their churches believe. Katherine, I'd like to bring you into this conversation. What do you think are the questions that should be asked about?
I agree with the points made by Adele and Heidi. Most of the pollsters, unfortunately, and many journalists fail to distinguish members of certain rough categories of religion, which tend to be very politically diverse groups, from those who are in alignment with the Christian right. And at least, I would say, loosely in agreement with Christian nationalism, or the idea that the United States is and ought to be a Christian nation governed under a reactionary understanding of Christian values. I mean, to be sure, many, if not most, American Christians center their understanding of their faith on the social gospel and reject the sort of politics of the sort of hard right politics that the Christian right represents. But it's the Christian right that's the hard base for the sort of illiberal brand of politics that we have come to know as Trumpism. As Adele mentioned, evangelicalism, like every other form of religion in America, is very diverse. So the movement includes many evangelicals, but it excludes many evangelicals too, including a smaller but significant percentage of white evangelicals and most evangelicals of color. And as Heidi mentioned, it also includes a variety of both of non-Protestant types of religion, including, subsection, of course, of Pentecostals and Charismatics, which are often sort of underrepresented in the reporting, ultra-conservative Catholics. And the movement even draws support from some people and groups that don't identify as Christian at all. And what unites the movement is sort of a common political vision. Many of evangelicals, of course, would not go along with that. So I think when we're reporting on these issues, it's important not to lose sight of these nuances.
In the wake of the election, there's been some reporting on whether or not Donald Trump was able to maintain his overwhelming support from white evangelicals, or whether or not in some states he was unable to hold on to some percentage of that. The exit polls are still kind of being analyzed for different places. But I want to get kind of y'all sense of what you think of kind of the reporting, post-election reporting looks like to you. Do you think the media is doing any kind of good job at looking at how white evangelicals or the Christian right kind of voted in this election?
Well, I think we're really stymied by the problem of not being able to trust exit polls or other polling in the wake of this election. And I know that we're being very cautious at NCR about what kind of stories we're going to be doing based on analysis that would come from those numbers. So once again, we had pre-election polling that wasn't as accurate as we would have liked, but I think some general trends can be discerned and again, pending better data. And that is that at least on the Catholic side, I can say that Donald Trump did lose some of the white Catholic vote that he had the first time around, although, broadly maintaining more of it than I would have thought. And that we did see some movement in terms of Donald Trump making some gains among Latino Catholics, especially specific subsets of Latino Catholics, which of course are a very diverse and complex group too. So I know we're going to be taking a look very closely. We were not surprised by Miami-Dade County and the Cuban Americans, especially Catholics, the way those votes came back for Donald Trump, but there were some heavily Mexican-American places along the border that we were surprised Donald Trump made gains with.
All right, well, I want to go ahead and move on to our second topic about race. And I think also I want to bring in gender as well into a discussion about what those two identities play within the Christian right. When you look at who are kind of some of the most prominent voices within the Christian right, the voices that are most often amplified, they tend to be white, cisgender men. But I want to know from y'all's experience, I mean, is how diverse is the Christian right? I mean, I think most people that have taken a look at it seriously see that it's not necessarily just white evangelicals. There's quite a diversity of people that are kind of within that coalition. So I want to start with Adelle. How do you think journalists should approach looking at the Christian right through a framing of both race and gender?
As Katherine said, it's just like white evangelicals, Black and Latinx Christians, whether evangelical or not, are not monolithic. And anybody who thinks they are just doesn't, has to look more carefully. Black Christians overall can be conservative theologically sometimes while being progressive in their support of social issues and government involvement in improving society. And Black evangelicals probably don't call themselves that term. But if you go to a Black church where they're going to be hoping that if you're not a Christian, you're going to come forward to the altar call and become a Christian. And that's the same thing that white churches that call themselves evangelical want. One interesting group to look at that I think some don't highlight as much recently is the National Association of Evangelicals. And that in these grand terms, is a little more moderate evangelical group than some of the more well-known evangelicals that whose names people hear quite a bit. And they in and of themselves have demonstrated the diversity of evangelicals. Its brand new president is Walter Kim, and he's an Asian American. Its new chair is John Jenkins, and he's an African American megachurch pastor. And its vice chair is Joanne Lyon, a white woman who is a former official of the Wesleyan Church. And its former president, Leith Anderson, who is a white man, pointed out that the growing edge of evangelicalism is significantly in minority communities and churches. So there is that awareness in some circles that I think it would be good for that awareness to be broader. And Latinx Christians are also varied, as Heidi was mentioning. My colleague Jack Jenkins interviewed Gabriel Salguero, the founder of the National Latino Evangelical Coalition, since the election. And he talked about the differences that, at least at this point, exit polls are showing that Hispanics with ties from Cuba who carried Trump with 55%, while others with ties to Puerto Rico only did 30% back Trump. So there is definitely a range within different racial ethnic groups in evangelicalism, and I think people need to be more aware of that.
Yeah, Heidi, I think people, the general public, I think, might not necessarily be aware how important, say, for example, Latinx Catholics are part of that Christian right coalition, especially when you look at the anti-abortion movement, right? They are very heavily involved. So could you talk a little bit about that as well?
Sure, I think so. There's some. It's complicated though, and I think that's going to be maybe the takeaway that everyone will take from this webinar is that don't fall for the simplistic categories. So first of all, Latino Catholics, yes, are very politically aligned with the conservative movement on issues like abortion, on social issues, possibly even about LGBT rights. But on the other hand, they tend to be very progressive on economic issues or on immigration or on a number of other issues. So they're not easily categorized in either right or left. Also, a trend that we noticed with this election cycle was you used to be able to assume that most Latinos were Catholic, and that's not the case anymore either. So there's been decades of inroads made by evangelicals, Protestants, in getting Latinos to convert to that religion. So I think we're seeing that the importance of the evangelical Latinx vote is important too. I just know that within Catholic circles, we can't talk about the Catholic vote anymore. It's always the white Catholic vote, and we predominantly talk about the Latino or Latinx Catholic vote because they're our largest ethnic group. But I would just say race is a huge category now and something we really have to look at.
Right. Heidi, I think you bring up a great point about the kind of changing religious preferences within the Latinx community. I think one thing I think it's important for people to be aware of is those changes are happening outside of the United States too. I think Pentecostalism is one of the fastest growing denomination of Christianity in South America right now. So we are seeing a lot of changes in that. Heidi, I want to bring you in here. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this and also the role that gender plays within the Christian right and what that means.
Maybe you meant Catherine?
Oh, excuse me. Yes, Catherine. I'm sorry.
Oh, sure. It's interesting. Some Pentecostal and charismatic churches and religious organizations are tolerant of female leadership. I mean, if you think about leaders like Cindy Jacobs or Paula White, but advocating patriarchy, or I would say female subordination at home and at church has become a fairly normalized feature of the Christian right. And I think this aspect of it is often overlooked. We see a lot of articles about the hipster churches, for instance, and they focus on the sort of trappings like, oh gosh, the pastor is wearing sneakers and jeans and the worship band is really great. So it feels like this really equitable space. But when you dig into the theological doctrines of the parent organizations, often these are sort of church plants of like larger parachurch organizations. When you dig into their theological doctrines, you'll find that they promote male headship at church and at home. It's really interesting that they understand I think that makes them vulnerable in today's relatively gender equal society. And so you'll find often they've responded by developing a kind of rhetoric that allows them to pretend that they're actually championing women. They'll often express this as like women and men are created equal, but with different roles, a kind of embracing a complementarianism. But there's still a sort of clear hierarchy within that sort of created equal, but with different roles, as it were. But still, I think it's important to remember that a lot of the women who are sort of part of these organizations believe they're truly fighting for women's dignity. And you know, others may think that they are deluded about that, but we have to understand that that is their position.
You know, I think this brings up something I'd love to hear all of your take on, and that was the coverage and reporting around the nomination of now Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett. I wonder what you think about the coverage of that, and how you think the fact that she is a woman from with Catholic faith, from from an organization that had that Catholic charismatic tradition. I wonder what your all's thoughts are on how the media handled the coverage of her nomination.
Well, as somebody who wrote about the People of Praise a couple of years ago when her name was first floated, and then we revisited it again this year, I can tell you that's a perfect example of some of this synergy between evangelical Protestantism. The Catholic charismatic movement came right, in the 60s, came right out of that, the Protestant movement. So the coverage of her, I think, was very interesting because the Democrats were in a tough position because any questioning of her religious beliefs and how they might be related to some of her ideological beliefs and how it might affect her on the court were going to be called anti-Catholicism. So they were very reluctant, and I think smartly so avoided those questions. But meanwhile, the media filled in and did a lot of reporting around the People of Praise. We ran an article, an opinion piece that I thought gave a good point because a number of conservative Catholics were holding Amy Coney Barrett up as a feminist because, if it was a anti-feminist group that she belonged to, it wasn't doing a very good job as she was nominated to one of the biggest jobs in our country. But of course, she has, as a white woman of economic means, she is not typical. And our columnist argued that she's not a feminist at all because even though she was taking advantage of her privilege to be able to be both a mother of a large family and to have this job, she wasn't making decisions as that leader that helped raise up other women.
Katherine or Adelle, either of you have thoughts on this?
I just want to mention that I think it was interesting when she was speaking at the White House, how she highlighted her husband. And it was interesting to me that I don't recall other justices highlighting their spouses, but it was interesting too, because even though she was highlighting her husband, she was thanking him for his help around the house, which is not something you normally hear from the people in this realm, even though I'm sure husbands are helping around the house all the time.
Katherine, do you have any thoughts to share?
Well, I think a sort of undercovered feature of the Christian right is how allied it is with sort of libertarian, sort of a hard right, sort of far right economic wing of the Republican Party. And I just think there wasn't enough reporting. I would have loved to see more reporting on the amounts of money that were spent promoting her candidate, her nomination, and that have been spent promoting other candidates for the Supreme Court. I think that people often focus on the sort of culture war issues like abortion and same-sex marriage and things like that. But if you look at the groups that are actually spending millions of dollars to promote these sort of right-wing candidates for the court and having that are groomed through the Federalist Society and other right-wing legal organizations, they're as committed, if not more committed, to a kind of almost like a free market fundamentalism and allied often with sort of interests of plutocratic power that are as interested in, minimal regulation of government or no regulation, minimal regulation of the environment. They're against progressive income taxes and things like that. And I just would have loved to see more of that featured in the coverage of Barrett.
Okay, well, I'm going to head and move on to our third topic, and that is about political influence. Specifically, where is the political center of gravity within the Christian right? When you look at how the media covers the Christian right, a large part of the focus tends to be on prominent organizations that are very politically active, whether we're talking about organizations like the Family Research Council or Alliance Defending Freedom. There's also a lot of focus on influential pastors or clergy members. I think Paula White was mentioned earlier, and she is a close advisor to President Trump, or people like Reverend Robert Jeffers, who's a pastor of a mega church here in Dallas, Texas. But I wonder if that's really where the real political center of gravity is within the Christian right. I mean, how influential are those organizations within the kind of rank and file members of the Christian right, the people that make up such a large part of the conservative coalition and large influential part of the Republican Party? I would love to hear your thoughts on what you think about that and whether or not the media is focusing in the right places. And I'll go ahead and start with Katherine on this question.
I think it's important to note that this is a leader-driven movement. I mean, the agenda is not set by the rank and file, which includes a wide range of people with very diverse interests and backgrounds and ideas. So I think the focus on the organizations like the Family Research Council and the Alliance Defending Freedom, or focus on the family with their enormous budgets, is a really good way to look at it. I mean, they're the ones with the money and the messaging, and they set the agenda for the rank and file. We kind of see this most clearly in issues like the culture war issues like abortion, which has been cast as the answer to every difficult policy question. In a way, they work so hard to create these single issue voters, or people who vote on 2 or 3 issues. If you can get people to vote on, a very small number of issues, you can capture and control their vote. The movement's greatest asset, I feel, is its national infrastructure. And that infrastructure consists not only of these organizations that unite and coordinate the leadership, which sort of flows in and out. There's not like a pope or like a single leader or a small group. It's like a kind of number of densely interconnected leaders. But they also work with numerous media and messaging platforms in order to get the message out to the rank and file about the issues that they should consider when they think about voting. So I think that this leadership in these organizations have had really considerable success in uniting a fairly disparate group of people around their sort of common political vision and mobilizing them to get out the vote for the candidates that their movement favors.
Adele, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, about where the political center of gravity is within the Christian right.
I think people may think it's always on the far right, but I believe that it really depends on the topic. And when you go beyond the hot button issues, as Katherine was speaking of, specifically abortion and LGBTQ rights, you tend to find that there can be evangelicals who will speak to other topics, and sometimes people from a variety of different points of view may at least care about the same things, like the environment, for instance, which some evangelicals call creation care. There's an evangelical environmental network, which some people may not even realize exists. But those kinds of topics, I think, are ripe for additional exploration by journalists. Also, the concerns about racism, that it's a very interesting divide within evangelicalism and beyond it, where some people are more inclined to focus on racial reconciliation, which has to do with your individual relationship with your, person down the pew from you or neighbor, versus racial justice, which is confronting institutional racism. And so you get different approaches. And I think those are some of the things that may help people have a better sense of the center, or where, if there is one at all, within the political realm. You'll also get different points of view from people like we mentioned, Paul White and Franklin Graham might be different than, say, some of the evangelical relief organizations, World Relief and World Vision, that might care about poverty and immigrants. So I think that there's a way to look more broadly as to what is at the center of some of these people's political concerns.
You know, Heidi, the Catholic right is a important part of the kind of overall Christian right coalition, but I think it's been interesting over the last several years. There does seem to be a divergence within the Catholic community, especially there does seem to be a lot of dissenting voices as rising in opposition to things that Pope Francis has said. So could you speak a little bit about where that political center of gravity lies within the Catholic part of the Christian right?
Yeah, so we're different in that we have a very structural hierarchical church, obviously, and just on the issue of gender, that of course excludes women from leadership, since they cannot be ordained in the church, and most positions of leadership in the Catholic Church are held by ordained people. And then on the other hand, we do have organizations that have grown, and again, this is, I think, conservative Catholics taking a page from the playbook of evangelical organizations. So we have, you know, Bill Donahue at the Catholic League. We have Curtis Martin, who has created this organization called Focus that's primarily on college campuses, but is interconnected with so many other Catholic groups. Tim Bush, multimillionaire, who created the Napa Institute. And you'll note that those three men that I just named are white men. So they're not that different than the bishops. So I think, you know, it's hard, structurally, the political, it seems like the center would be our bishops' conference or the Pope. But too often our bishops' conference is divided amongst themselves, and a number of US bishops, unfortunately, were named during the pontificate of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, who was, or 15th, who were way more concerned about ideological purity and not having any good pastoral skills. And so we have some of these culture war bishops, too many of them, in our bishops' conference, and they're fighting amongst themselves. They'll be meeting virtually on Monday and Tuesday, and we'll see where they go from here. Just to follow up on what Katherine said about the issue of libertarianism, right before the election, a couple of weeks beforehand, Pope Francis issued only his third, really his second encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, that was hugely anti-libertarian, and it got a little bit lost, I think, because the religious right, the Catholic right, has a lot of money. They have a lot of media power, especially on social media. We see things like EWTN, which I just learned last night, has joined Parler, which is a very bad sign. And then we have things like LifeSite News and Church Militant, which are kind of para-journalistic organizations that are just have a lot of money and are really getting the message out there that of the kind of that extreme right view of Catholicism.
You're muted, Teddy.
I said, thank you. I've said, you know, we've been talking about this, about all this and having this conversation kind of within a national context, but I want to bring it down a level, I think, around where the political center of gravity is, can be different depending on what part of the country you're in, right? So I spent 5 years covering reproductive rights in state legislatures, and it depends on the influence of the Christian right and what that makeup of that coalition can look very different depending on where you are, right? The Catholic Church has much more influence in a state like Louisiana than it does in a state like Kansas. And so I want to have each of you kind of talk a little bit about that, about how the Christian right and that coalition and these differences can look very different in different parts of the country. I'll start with Adele, if you could share some thoughts on that.
That's a good question. There's always the thought that in the South, there's just this expectation that you're a Christian, which is not necessarily true. And so there may be more of a coalition of folks who, because of that assumption, are able to move politicians in a particular way and have them listen to them. So places where, often people who are conservative Christians are also Republican, and so they would have more of a control in those places. But I do think, again, I was going to mention later that it's really important when you're interviewing people to ask for a representation of groups in other geographic areas so that you aren't just sort of siloing your coverage to particular parts of the country.
Katherine, could you share some of your thoughts with this? You've traveled quite a bit for your research for your books.
Yeah, that's right. Sometimes you'll find a lot of these religious initiatives, religious right initiatives that have an influence in other parts of the country or even the world, originating in places that you wouldn't imagine. So I found an awful lot of these initiatives in California, believe it or not, which has this reputation of being a blue state. But it's a very mixed picture. I also think it's really important to note that sometimes we see religious initiatives that appear to be local in nature, but actually are the work of these organizations that are sort of much more national or even international in their focus. So it's always interesting to see where, say, a policy group is coming from. Is it really a policy group that originated in Minnesota, or is it part of a national organization? Or you could say the same thing about Rhode Island or other types of Vermont or other blue states. So it's really important to sort of follow the organizations to their origin.
I can add, it might be worth literally doing a Google search of some language if you hear one state doing it, to see if another one does. And sometimes you'll find out that it's because the language was written by one of these overarching organizations that we've been talking about that really have a national reach, but they're reaching into the states and saying, hey, why don't you offer this to your legislatures?
That's right, Adele, like Project Blitz, which was a national legislative initiative where they crafted very similar pieces of legislation that could be adopted by politicians who were sort of favorable to the agenda. So then multiple states sort of adopted these sort of "in God we trust" laws. And it looks like a local initiative, but in fact, it's crafted by a national organization.
That's exactly the one I was speaking of. Thank you, Katherine.
Sure.
I'd love to bring Heidi in on this, especially around the point that Adele just brought up about language, right? I think for a lot of journalists, the Christian right, they speak a different language in some ways, right? They use language in very specific ways to mean different things. I think if you're not familiar with it or steeped in it, it can be quite foreign. So Heidi, could you come in on this conversation and talk about that? And also, you look like you had another point to make too.
Well, yeah, that's just one of the pieces of evidence, I think, to show the synergy between some of these Protestant evangelical groups and the conservative Catholic ones, is that they are using the same language. And on the geographical question, of course, the center of Catholicism in the United States for much of our history has been in the Northeast and in the Midwest. But that has been shifting for a while. And I think as reporters, it's sometimes hard for us to get out of those bunker mentalities of constantly talking to people in the Northeast and in the Midwest. But the real growth in Catholicism is in the South and in the West. So, and among Latinos, of course. So, but I would say, in addition to looking for language, it's to look at the money. So, I've done a number of reports where I spent a lot of time with 990s and looking at funders of organizations. So, for example, I did a 4-part series on EWTN. They're based in the South, but a lot of their money is coming from these other Catholic right-wing donors and organizations that are not in the South. So following the language and the money would seem like good advice to journalists.
All right. Well, I think I want to go ahead and move on and have some space for us to maybe discuss some other things. I'm going to be looking at some of the questions that our audience have and maybe pose some of those to our panelists. But I would just want to open it up a little bit for each of you. If there's anything that we haven't touched on yet, if there's something that you think is really critical for journalists to understand in covering the Christian right in a more nuanced and complex way. And actually, I think specifically one of the things that I wanted to talk about too was how to cover the Christian right in a way that doesn't alienate Christians, particularly progressive Christians or Christians that are much more moderate. I think some of the coverage can be maybe too overgeneralized, right? And I think there's a lot of Christians out there that feel like they are being lumped into kind of a group of people that they don't necessarily associate with. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. How do we cover the Christian right and without alienating progressive Christians?
Well, I guess I'll just jump in here. I mean, part of it would be to cover progressive Christians as well. So obviously we're talking about the power and influence and money of the Christian right. And so of course that is deserving of coverage. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. But I think it is alienating to moderate and progressive Christians when they are kind of treated by the media as if they don't exist. So, I think that's good advice as well.
I want to note that you're right. It's really hard to critique the political actions of religious groups without appearing to criticize religion itself, or even being accused of hating religion or being against God. So it's really hard to report on this type of, political phenomenon without being accused of being anti-religious. And I think the problem is that results in a kind of underreporting. I think that when reporters fail to note how politicized some movements have become and sort of the political power that they hold, which is a power that can be measured in terms of, their get out the vote machine. You really, it's minimizing the political role of religion is missing one of the greatest stories of our time. It's a story that's playing out with consequences in many countries. Especially as we're seeing the rise of religious authoritarianism. So I think if we just pretend it's all a matter of faith rather than savvy political organizing, we miss the big story. But there is a big difference between reporting on the political aspects of different religious groups and critiquing religion. And that's just a point that bears repeating all the time.
I wanted to go back to the issue of helping people identify who are evangelicals. And sometimes you have to spend a long time with people on the phone or in person to really understand them. And that's part of being a better journalist, is not just hoping for the 5-minute interview, because you need to be able to be prepared for long answers. If you ask somebody sometimes if they're evangelical, you'll get a long answer as to why they use that word, why they don't, what they believe, what they don't believe. And it's harder to pigeonhole people when they shun the E word, which I'm finding happens more and more. And I have a longer conversation to make sure that I'm representing who they are accurately. So I would say part of the journalism is literally being patient. And again, recognizing that these groups are not all monolithic. And if you're speaking to Black and Latinx Christians, for instance, and when you ask about their houses of worship, they may attend a multicultural congregation. You can't assume that they attend one that's predominantly of their race or ethnic group. But then again, there may be some who were attending a congregation, someone who's Black was attending a predominantly Black congregation, or somebody who's Spanish speaking, who was attending a Spanish speaking congregation, but then they left because, in part, of the politics. There are people who have literally left their places of worship because they couldn't worship anymore with people and pastors who, for instance, supported President Trump. So we have to keep asking not only what kind of church they attend, but how long they've attended it, because that might be part of the story.
One of our viewers asked a question from the UK perspective, and this is something that I've talked to reporters outside of the States about quite a bit as they try to understand the role the Christian right has in US politics, particularly as the Christian right has gotten more and more influential, involved internationally, right? As Open Democracy has done a lot of reporting on. But they have a hard time, I guess, wrapping their heads around how the Christians and these different parts of Christianity could kind of combine the theology of Jesus, right, with capitalism and neoliberalism. I think a lot of people see that as inherently there's a tension there, right? So I wonder if y'all could talk a little bit about that, about how the Christian right reconciles those two, that theological and ideological tension there, I think.
Well, the Christian right doesn't have a problem with that at all. In fact, there's a kind of, a lot of the leaders promote this idea of what they call biblical economics and say that, the government shouldn't be directly funding a lot of these initiatives that help the poor directly. A lot of that money should really be flowing through the churches first. And they embrace, I'm thinking about leaders like Ralph Drollinger, who's Capital has this ministry, Capital Ministry, targeting political leaders at the highest levels of power. He has these Bible studies that talk about, theory of, the idea of biblical economics means low taxation for the very wealthy. He's against progressive income taxes, minimal regulation of government, minimal regulation of business and things like that. Policies that serve to, it's a movement that claims to stand for family values, but they're embracing economic policies that are making it so much harder for so many American families to succeed. But they don't see a sort of contradiction in that. It's interesting, the whole Trump question, sort of how could, a lot of people ask, how could a movement stand behind such a leader who seems to embody every quality that would seem to be unchristian, and yet he's giving them everything they want. I think to a largely underappreciated degree, the movement achieves much of its aims through the courts. And to date, I think he's appointed, he's had, I think it's 220 of his justices confirmed, including 3 Supreme Court justices and federal circuits, et cetera. So he's put a stamp on a really substantial portion of the judiciary. At all of the different events I've been attending, since he came to office, he or his surrogates will stand up and say, I think I gave you, I versus you, I think I gave you everything you want. And in fact, I think I've given you more, access to power and influence, policies, or the attempt to create policies that privilege a certain varieties of faith over others, and certainly the courts.
To pick up on something, a theme that you mentioned there about President Trump, President Trump has never really, I think, professed to have a deep theological beliefs, but we do know something about the church that he grew up in, right? It is kind of one of these prosperity gospel type churches, which are very prominent, and I think one of the things that is interesting about them is the way they talk about wealth, right? And if you accumulate wealth, if you're successful, it's because you deserve it, because God has blessed you with those. And so that obviously means that if you are poor, then you must deserve it too. Especially Heidi, I mean, because you mentioned the radical traditionalist earlier. Could you talk a little bit about what you've seen from them and this economic question, because I think there's a real strain of that within that movement.
Yeah, and I think exactly, and I think it's very interesting. I'm grateful that many in our church leadership, including bishops, but especially this Pope Francis, and including even the more conservative popes before him in Benedict and John Paul II, were very critical of neoliberalism and its limits, and even of capitalism. So again, we have this encyclical document coming out from Pope Francis right before our election, in which he is highly critical of these kinds of economic systems and is continually holding up the poor and the marginalized. But then we have this very bizarre situation in which we have the traditionalists saying, well, maybe he's not the real Pope, or maybe we don't have to listen to the Pope, when so much of traditional Catholicism, of course, is based on obeying the hierarchy and the importance of hierarchical leadership in our church. So, I mean, that's sort of a tell, I think, a hint that maybe they're not so traditional after all, and that some of this, I think most pro-life people and anti-abortion people are very sincere in their desire to protect unborn life, but in many ways, this single issue voting about abortion ends up being a little bit of my colleague calls it a totem. It's something that stands for something else. And it's not just about abortion or abortion politics. It's about, do these politicians represent me more generally in what I think economically or around issues of race? I just wanted to add one other short thing, is just to be very careful of surveys or other attempts to define Catholics as not Catholic. So often you see in a survey, they'll break down the numbers based on people who attend Mass weekly versus people who don't attend regularly. In this day and age, when attendance to liturgy, of course, with the coronavirus is very off, but we have very varying degrees of institutional connection among Catholics. To try to find someone as not Catholic should be a red flag. And especially what we're seeing among many right-wing Catholics is to try to define Joe Biden as not Catholic, when the guy is about as Catholic as they come. I mean, down to the detail we had in our story that he arrives late and leaves early for Mass. So he is about as typical Catholic guy as you can find. But of course, there are these attempts to use his party's abortion views to define him as outside the circle.
Adelle, I'd love to bring you back in this conversation specifically about something you've touched on about the importance of interviewing folks, right? And talking to them at length. I think, could you elaborate more on that? Like what kind of skills and how important it is for folks to kind of go to these churches and go to these different places and actually spend time with folks. There's the trope of, going to the diner in Ohio, right, and interviewing folks there. I wonder if people should be spending more time in pews and talking to religious folks to get a better understanding of them.
Yeah, I think it's both going to where people worship and where people eat. I remember a long time ago, I used to work in Orlando at the Orlando Sentinel. And one of the things I did to first get to know some of the African-American clergy was to go where they like to get together and eat, and not necessarily go, if you are a local reporter and you're not dealing with COVID and those precautions, of course, but in regular times, you can go and visit with somebody and actually, leave your notebook in your pocket and just get to know them a little bit. And then say, the next time we meet, I'm going to take out my computer. I'm going to take out my notebook. There is an issue of cultivating sources and getting to know people truly human to human. And, you don't have to get into what you agree and disagree on personally. You can just get to know them a little bit. So that's a piece of it. But yes, and these days, of course, we can watch people on TV, listen to the sermons sometimes, get a sense of what they're saying. And you may listen to a sermon that's mostly theological that you think, oh, I'm not going to report about this, but you never know what they're going to throw in as the perfect example to make it, so to speak, relevant, a big term that's used in church circles, to the people in the pew. So I can't emphasize enough how much there needs to be patience and a willingness to listen to people, because you may get the best quote 25 minutes in to a half-hour interview. And so some of it is a matter of just giving people time to really tell you who they are.
Right. I definitely agree. I think, being off the record and having discussion over some barbecue really goes a long way in cultivating sources.
And I want to say that I'm not big on going off the record on a regular basis, but there are times when it makes sense, both at the beginning of a reporter-source relationship and far into it, that there are times when they're just not going to want you to report that, but they want you to understand something or understand where they're coming from. But for the most part, I do highly recommend staying on the record.
Right. Well,
oh, sorry.
I was going to say we only have a few minutes left. So I wanted to go around the panel and just in 30 seconds or a minute, if you could just kind of give folks an idea of what are some of the big topics you think folks should be thinking about as far as covering the Christian right and maybe religion more broadly within the next year or two. If you could kind of just pick something that you think is going to be really important for journalists to look at and watch in the future. And we'll go ahead and start with Adelle.
The two things I think I'd say is that you might ask them, since we're talking about politics here, about how they think the next presidential administration is going to affect them. Ask clergy, ask lay people in these different realms, because it may be different this time around. It may be a change. There's issues. We had a story yesterday about how people are going to manage unity in these days. And I think that's going to be a big question. Is going to be a question on like next steps about dealing with race relations and a lot of different topics. And the other thing I'll say while I have the floor is that one of the things you should always ask people is, who else should I talk to? Because when you start diversifying your coverage, then you talk to the next person that's recommended. Who else do you know who's of in your racial ethnic group, or in another racial ethnic group, or in another geographic area, or another gender? Just make sure that you keep broadening your reach by asking everyone you know who else you should talk to, everyone you interview.
Heidi?
Yeah, I would just say post-election, because Catholics we're so practically 50-50 split, we're going to see a lot of conversation about polarization and possibly some people trying to just whitewash over that and say, can't we all just get along? I think there's going to be a lot of attention to race in the Catholic Church. I do think that if Roe versus Wade gets overturned and goes back down to the states, we'll be drowning in coverage of abortion. And I would just piggyback on what Adelle said about watching videos of people's sermons. So this is something that evangelical megachurches have been doing for a long time, but in Catholic churches was not so common until coronavirus. But now there is a treasure trove of clergy on the record, videotaping and sharing on social media that we didn't have before.
And Katherine, you'll get the last word on all of this.
Well, I agree with everything that Adelle and Heidi have said. And, I just am always listening carefully. I think listening is underrated, as Adelle said. And it's always important to listen carefully to find the little story that helps you tell the bigger story. And there's no shortage of stories to tell these days. So thanks so much.
All right, well, we're going to wrap up now. Thank you so much to each of my guests, to Adelle from the Religious News Service, to Heidi from the National Catholic Reporter, and to Katherine, whose book right here, I'm going to hold it up. I highly recommend The Power Worshippers. I also would encourage our audience, if you want to get updates for when we have weekly webinars on a variety of topics, you can sign up for Open Democracy's newsletter if you go to opendemocracy.net and look for our coverage on a lot of these topics. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us. Thank you so much to our panelists. It was really excellent. I'm very grateful to all of you for joining me, and I really appreciate all of your reporting and your advice on this. I think this has really been a great discussion. So thank you, and to our audience, until next time.